Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. I'm Papa Boris here playing some more chess, and in this video I'd like to show you another game by Rashid Gibeatovich Nezhmetdinov. This was his Immortal against Lev Polugaevsky. Now, Polugaevsky himself was a really strong player, absolutely one of the top 10 strongest players of the mid-20th century. Nezhmetdinov, by contrast, is a little bit of a sleeper hit in the chess world. If you don't poke around on YouTube or on chessgames.com, where his legacy is really appreciated, you probably don't know him. He certainly isn't a household name, even though my chess childhood was filled with chess books and chess camps, and I thought I knew all the great chess players. I'd never heard of this guy until I found his games being covered in videos on YouTube. Nezhmetdinov is very beloved for his ridiculously aggressive attacking style and for his ability to find wildly unpredictable ways to attack his opponent. Was he one of the greatest players of the 20th century? Technically not. His positional play wasn't up to the level of someone like Keres or Korchnoi. He was never able to beat a really defensive player like Tigran Petrosyan. And his record against Lev Polugaevsky, whom he beat in this game, was actually a losing one over the course of his life. For various political reasons, Nezhmetdinov didn't have the support of the other Soviet chess players. He was an oppressed minority. He never got to play internationally. And even though he won the Russian championship 4 times, he never actually got the Grandmaster title. He's maybe not the strongest player ever, but he's definitely the strongest international master of all time. It's pretty crazy how good this guy was for only technically having reached the title of international master, since Grandmasters are a dime a dozen in chess. There's scores of Grandmasters who lived completely unknown and undistinguished and unremarkable chess careers, but Nezhmetdinov's legacy is full of just some of the most beautiful chess that has ever happened. So I'll show you his Immortal here, and then I'm also going to cover some of his games later on against weaker opponents whom he just smacks like redheaded schoolboys. Anyway, Polugaevsky in this game opened with d4, and after knight f6, c4, we have a really unusual opening. I don't really see this very much. The d6 version of the Indian. This is called the Old Indian Defense. After knight to c3, we have e5, the Ukrainian variation. I'm honestly not sure I've ever seen another game that used this variation. It is allegedly pretty good for white. If white plays knight to f3 here, then if black captures on d4 and white recaptures with the knight, then this is all well and good for white. Perhaps Polugaevsky wasn't prepared for this. He played e4, and now after black takes on d4 and the queen takes, black actually gets to develop a knight with tempo on the queen, and this is a very nice opening for black. So Nezhmetdinov was maybe not as strong positionally or in the endgame as some other top players of the day, but when he was at his best, he could outplay the best, even in the opening. Here on move 6, black has already pretty much equalized. Now, this queen d2 move blocks the bishop on this diagonal, so that makes it pretty clear that Polugaevsky is planning to play b3 and develop the bishop on this diagonal instead. Nezhmetdinov replies in kind. He plays g6, and then after b3, both players put their bishops on that diagonal. Here, black castles. White plays bishop to d3 to develop this bishop and add some support to this e4 pawn. And Nezhmetdinov wastes no time getting aggressive. He plays knight to g4. So here, white's in a bit of an uncomfortable position. Perhaps the best response would have been just to play knight f3 and stop the black queen from coming to h4. Maybe Polugaevsky was concerned about moves like knight to e5, which fork the bishop, and also this knight. But if you do just take the knight here and then let black recapture and just play bishop to e2, everything's fine. This square is protected, so the knight, can't stay here, and the queen coming to h4 doesn't really achieve anything for black. But Polugaevsky was concerned, or maybe didn't see knight f3, so he played knight g to e2, and this is a little bit weird. Here, Nezhmetdinov plays queen to h4, and now this f2 pawn is threatened because the knight on e2 is blocking the white queen's view of the f2 pawn. You can't castle queenside because then your rooks get forked and you're down the exchange. Congratulations, you suck. Or you certainly can't castle kingside either because then you really suck. You're getting mated on h2. Now, I'm guessing Polugaevsky had a plan because queen h4 is kind of an obvious move if your opponent plays knight g4 in the previous move. His plan was to play knight to g3 and use the knight as a blocker. The problem with knight to g3, though, is that black is going to start pushing this f-pawn, which is a thing that black pretty much always does in the king's Indian defense, at least when black wants to get an attack going, and this pawn is going to kick this knight away. As ugly as it would have been, white probably would have been better off playing g3. Even though it seems to weaken all these squares, black actually can't really take advantage of that weakness. And this is a good rule of thumb in chess. If you have a weakness that your opponent can't take advantage of, it's not really a weakness. Like if the black queen tries to squirrel in here with queen to h3, then white has knight to f4. Now the queen is attacked, and this sensitive square g2 is also covered by the knight. So the queen's not getting in here. Black has nothing better to do here than just play queen to h6, white castles queenside, and everything is peachy. White's actually doing better here. So that probably would have been the best bet for Polugaevsky. However, he played knight to g3, and here Nezhmetdinov should have just played knight to f5, but he decided to move his knight to e5 first, which is a little slow. It works a little better if you play f5 first. But knight to e5 is a sensible move for a human being to make. It centralizes the knight, keeps an eye on this bishop, you know, and you can still keep pushing f5 later. So I don't want to go too hard on Nezhmetdinov for playing it this way. Polugaevsky castled, and then Nezhmetdinov began to push his pawn. Here, it might have been better just to capture on f5. And then if black wants to keep this pawn on the f-file, then now this pawn has no buddies. It's an isolated pawn, and black's king is a little bit weakened himself. However, Polugaevsky played f3, which is a little bit timid, and it allows black to keep both the f and g pawns, which as we'll see is pretty darn handy. So first, black kicks white's queen away with bishop to h6, and after the queen moves, pushes f4. So now there's this pawn here kicking this defender away, and the g pawn is right behind it, ready to go. The knight retreats, and the g-pawn starts rocking. And at this point, maybe Polugaevsky regretted that he didn't exchange on f5 when he had the chance. Now, Polugaevsky is a very, very strong player. Lesser players would have crumbled here, but Polugaevsky found a really great defense. This is the best move in the position, knight to d5. So the idea with knight to d5 is a few things. First of all, it unleashes this bishop on this diagonal, which allows it to sometimes trade with this knight on e5, and that can be important. And furthermore, this knight can look over the e3 square, which is quite valuable, because once these pawns are out of here, the black bishop in some variations might look to come to e3 and give check, and so having the square supported by the knight on d5 is very good. Plus on d5, the knight is centralized and it's difficult to kick. Notice, too, the knight is attacking this pawn, but, you know, you gotta know as an attacker when it's okay to just let material go and when you've gotta, like, play the slow game. And Nezhmetdinov here realized correctly that it's time to attack. There's no time to protect this pawn. And white would be an idiot to take it. Here, black is just winning the game with g3. So what are you doing with your life now as white? You're threatened with mate on h2. Taking the pawn doesn't do any good because you're still threatened with mate on h2. Now you gotta give up your knight. And you're still getting mated here. Actually, queen takes the knight is not even the right move. The right move is bishop check first, and then take the knight. And now white is getting mated in a few moves. So Polugaevsky, of course, was a world-class player. He's not going to fall for this. He's going to realize that g3 is a winning move. So he plays g3 himself to block it. And here the position is more or less equal, but it definitely feels worse to be white than black here, because as white, you're the one whose king is starting to feel a little bit oppressed. Okay, Nezhmetdinov takes on g3, and after white recaptures, he plays queen to h3. Now Polugaevsky plays f4, and this was his plan. Use this knight on e2, which is holding this pawn away from the queen. White's king safety here is pretty much held together with prayers and popsicle sticks, but it's kind of holding up. The weak point is, of course, this f4 pawn, because if black could clear that out and unleash the rook, then things would get very bad for white very fast. But this is under lock and key. You got two knights, a rook, and a pawn, all protecting this f4 pawn. Now, black also has to be very careful, because if white can ever move his king and then play rook to h1, this queen's actually trapped. So when you're the black attacker here, your position is technically better, but you have to play very precisely, because anything less than the utmost precision and you're going to lose the game. So first things first, Nezhmetdinov plays bishop to e6. The idea here is, first of all, to perhaps let this rook come into the game at some point, but second of all, to capture away this knight on d5, so that if this f-pawn were to ever move, either by taking the knight on e5 or by being pushed, the black bishop could come to e3 and give check, and pretty much mate the white king. It is worth noting that not only is the c-pawn still attacked, but now black has also left this knight hanging. However, both of those things are immune. If you take the c-pawn, then that's just a disaster. Black can pretty much basically just play rook takes f4 here and punch through like a caveman. If you take the rook, for example, there's g3, and there's really just no stopping this. You know, you have to basically, to prevent this checkmate on h2, you have to give back a knight here, and then black can give some checks, bring a bishop in here. I mean, it's just ugly, and you're completely hosed as white. If you take the knight on e5, that is even worse, because here black can take a knight back on d5. Material is equal, and if you make the mistake of taking this bishop, it's actually just a mate in 2 after bishop to e3. The king has nowhere to run, and this is checkmate right here. So Nezhmetdinov is walking a hell of a tightrope here with his knight and pawn hanging, but everything is immune. It's all protected by tactics. And here, the best defense for white would have been knight takes e5. It may seem like it doesn't achieve much because the knight is recharged, but as we'll see later, this bishop on b2 does jack, squat, and dickerdoodle, whereas the knight on c6 ends up being very handy for black. So if white had taken this moment to make that exchange and then proceeded to do whatever it was that he was going to do, he would have potentially been able to get away with a draw or even a win. The engine calls this position dead equal. However, Polugaevsky played bishop to c2, which does have some merit. It makes it so that if black takes on d5, the queen takes on d5 with check, and then the black king is the one that's looking a little bit uncomfortable on this diagonal with the dark squared bishop. This may be what Polugaevsky was thinking when he chose not to exchange the bishop on e5. Like, hey, maybe I can get a counterattack against the black king someday. But the problem is, first of all, that Nezhmetdinov plays rook to f7. By the way, according to the engine, taking on d5 would have been good for black as well. The reason that rook takes f7 is considered bad by the engine is that it gives white another chance to take on e5. But given that white showed a lack of interest in taking on e5, rook f7 is actually a pretty good move. And now Polugaevsky continues with his plan. He plays king to f2. So the idea here is that he's going to trap the queen by playing rook to h2. And this is one of those moments that just really shows the genius of Nezhmetdinov as an attacking player, because here he had to have some idea in mind of the ridiculous sacrifice that came later. And I don't even know how much calculation that would have required to, in this seemingly relatively innocuous position, start thinking about some of the fireworks that are to come, because this looks all quiet. You have to think several moves ahead and then come up with the sacrifice and then all the ramifications of it. And we're going to see, like, even with an engine and all the time in the day, it's still very difficult to untangle all the pieces. I can't imagine doing this over the board with a clock ticking and having to stare at this position and not see any other moves. But black has to play queen to h2 check here, which Nezhmetdinov did. And after king to e3, note, by the way, you can't run to e1. That's just crazy. Knight to f3, the king has no moves, and you've just lost the exchange, and the pain train is continuing to hit you. So king to e3 was the plan by Polugaevsky, and a rather clever one, because it's scary putting the king here, but Polugaevsky realized, you know, the king's kind of safe here. And now white is threatening to play rook to h1. So the idea here is that if as black you just make some normal old move like, oh, let's double my rooks, you know, then after rook to h1, the queen moves and you take on h6. You know, white's just won the bishop, and there's no attack for black. Black is just completely losing here. The knight's hanging. I mean, it's just all over. So Nezhmetdinov had to know what was coming, and here he played, first of all, bishop takes d5, getting rid of that key knight in the center, and after the knight is recaptured, knight to b4. Here, that knight that could have been moved away to e5, recharging this knight, gets a chance to reveal its usefulness, and he plays to b4. So now Polugaevsky plays rook to h1, and he had to think here that he was winning the game, because where exactly does this queen go? It only has one square, which is to g2, and then after rook takes h6, white's just up a piece and it's all over. I should note too, by the way, that like back here, instead of taking on d5, you know, lesser players might have played like queen to h5, for example, but then white still plays rook to h1, and after the queen moves, black no longer has an attack. And eventually some of these hanging pieces are going to fall. Yeah, after, let me actually proceed here with some of the moves. Knight to b4, rook to h1. Here, Nezhmetdinov surprised Polugaevsky and the world with the move rook takes f4. crazy move. And again, you don't just get to this position and are like, oh, hey, I got rook takes f4. You have to plan this in advance, because if you were gonna get here and not have this sacrifice planned, like if that's not the move you're making, you're losing the game after your queen moves and your bishop falls. So I don't know. I wish I could get into his head. I wish I could know exactly when Nezhmetdinov had planned this sacrifice. But this is pretty remarkable, because not only is the rook hanging, but the queen is hanging. And if white takes the queen, he's just up a whole queen. So this is like an entire queen for nothing sacrifice. Let's take a look at what happens if the queen sack is ignored. If you take the rook, then it's very bad news bears for you. After bishop takes f4, there's really no way for white to avoid either losing massive amounts of material or getting his king mated. I'm not going to show every single variation, but for example, if you take back the bishop, now, what black takes the bishop on c2, the white king has nowhere to run, and so the queen is lost, just like that. And at this point, white only has a rook and a bishop for the queen, so white's definitely down material. Say you try to run. If you go here, then queen to f2 check, king to c3, and whoops, queen to c5 is checkmate. So there's just no way, because the white king is so constricted, to get out of this as white, either without getting mated or without losing a ton of material. And taking with the knight isn't any better. This is actually even worse. According to the engine, it's a forced mate in 16. I don't know if anyone would actually calculate that over the board, but you can see that after the bishop takes the knight, this king is completely exposed. All these squares around the king are totally covered, and white's pieces are too blocked up and disorganized around here to mount any kind of a defense. Say you try to move the queen and let the king escape, you know, here's queen to e3, king d1, queen d2, checkmate. There are ways that white can hold out for longer. It is, according to the engine at this point, a mate in 10, but there's just no way to hold off the mate forever. So you can't take the rook, and if you're not taking the rook, you got to take the queen, which Polugaevsky did. I mean, if you're not going to take the queen, you're not getting anything out of not taking it. The queen's just going to sit there if you don't take it, so it's got to get snapped up. Now comes rook to f3 double check, and the king is pushed into the only square he can go to, which is d4. And it's quite amazing, although the king is in the center, you really have to know what you're doing in order to finish this game off with a win. A lot of players, I think, here as black would just play bishop to e3 check, and amazingly, this is totally winning for white. The white king has only a single square, which is c3, but here he's kind of untouchable. The black knights don't have any way of attacking the white king, and the only way, therefore, to give check is to move this bishop and do a discover check on the rook. But if you move the bishop like this, then the king runs to d2, and then if you try to give check again, the king runs to e1, and now, whoops, you're out of checks, and the king is totally safe. If you try to run in the other direction, so that you can, for example, prevent the king from running to d2, then the king is just going to take this knight on b4. So now you've lost a queen and a knight, and that knight was pretty instrumental as a figure for, you know, preventing the white king from having places to go. And at this point, white's just totally won the game. So Nezhmetdinov found the correct move here, which is bishop to g7. What's really interesting about this move is that if you first play it, the engine actually calls this a mistake, and the engine thinks it's found a draw for white. In fact, one of my favorite chess channels on YouTube, Chess Network, covered this game, and I don't say this with an ounce of disrespect, but Chess Network says that after knight to g1, white has a draw. This is actually incorrect. White does not have a draw here. If you leave the engine on long enough, the engine finds the way to win. Now, to be fair, I don't know if Nezhmetdinov would have found it. It's quite a difficult process for black to win here, so I don't know if he knew it. Polugaevsky did not play knight to g1. It's a very difficult move to find with all this stuff happening around your king. Finding knight to g1, a retreating move to attack this rook, is very crazy and takes a lot of courage and calculation. But if white had played knight to g1, just to show how black wins this, first, black can just take this pawn on g3, and now the rook is still covering this entire rank. So white would have to attack the rook again, and then after the rook moves back to f3, white would have to put the knight back on g1. So it's the same exact position as when white went knight g1 initially, only now this pawn on g3 is missing. And at this point, black plays knight e to d3 check. This check has only two possible responses. You can either go king to c4 or e5. If you play e5, then after bishop takes e5, this is, according to the engine, a mate in 17, starting with king to c4 and rook to f4 check. The thing is that moving this pawn allowed the rook to give check on this row, which is how this mate ends up being possible. However, if you don't push the pawn and move to c4 straight away, sure, the rook can't come here and give check, but then what black has is knight takes b2 check, forking the king and the queen. Now, if white takes the knight, which he should, and black takes the queen, black's actually probably going to lose this game because you'll notice that black is up a piece. Or sorry, white is up a piece, black is down a piece. Black does have some compensation for the piece. He has these two connected passed pawns. So there is a fighting chance for black, but white is definitely better. However, the key here to realize, and I don't know if Nezhmetdinov calculated this in advance, but I think if you gave him this position, he would have found the right continuation, is for black to actually play a 5 check first, and then after the king moves to b5, note, by the way, there's no running to a3 because after b5 you get mated. Black has two simultaneous checkmate threats, b4 is mate, and knight to c4, taking advantage of this pinned pawn on b3 is mate, and white can only stop one but cannot stop both. So the king has to run forward to b5, and now you don't take the queen, you go rook to c3. So you see here, if the queen, which is currently hanging, moves, then black has rook to c5 checkmate, and that means that white has to do something about that checkmate, which means letting the queen go. And now, yeah, this is kind of similar as to what we saw earlier, where black is down a piece, but now black is the one who's winning, because one of two things is going to happen here. Either white is going to get mated because this king is in such a dangerous position, or if he's not getting mated, he's going to have to give up material. So, for example, let's say, you know, white wants to stop from getting mated, and he tries to make some kind of a defensive move, like rook to d3. You know, then black can push b3, for example, attacking this bishop. And now if you try to, like, you know, say exchange here, exchange, take on c3, then, like, black can play on a2, and he's, like, threatening to make a queening move. You know, if you try to play, for example, e5, then after bishop takes e5 and white takes on h7 with check, you know, either you let this rook go or you let this bishop go, or if you like move the rook in such a way that it continues to protect the bishop, then black plays rook to a6. And now this mating net is weaving tighter around the white king. If you say, okay, let me move my bishop so that my rook can move without letting the bishop fall on h7, then rook to b6 is check. After the king goes to a4 or to a5, rook to a3 is checkmate. And that's kind of the way that things are going to fall for white from this position. His pieces are so discoordinated that either he will lose one and then black is up several pawns and wins the game, or if white tries to find a way to hang on to all of his pieces, then the king gets mated. Now, I don't think that Nezhmetdinov had all of that calculated when he played bishop to g7, but for the matter of technical record, knight g1 is white's best defense, but it does allow black to make this clever pawn grab, and then after the repetition, fork white's queen. Again, the key here being that you don't take the queen right away. First, you drive the king deeper into your territory, get your rook out of harm's way, and then force white to lose the queen under more advantageous circumstances. But okay, let's say that you're white and you're not playing knight to g1 here. What are you going to play? Well, the threat here, I'll show you if I just make a dummy move for white, is b5. b5 cuts off the king's flight square to c4, and now no matter what white does here, knight to c6 is checkmate. It attacks the king twice with the knight and with the bishop. The c5 square is covered by the pawn on d6. The e5 and c3 squares are covered by the bishop. The rook's guarding the third row, so you can see that we have this key square on c4 that was covered by that b5 pawn. So Polugaevsky thought, okay, well, let me stop this threat, and he played a4. This stops b5. But the problem with a4 is that now there's this other way for black to win, which is c5 check. The king has nowhere to run, so the pawn must be taken en passant, and now black plays b takes c6. So black is saying here, I don't need to move my knight to c6 to give checkmate. I'm fine leaving this knight here to guard c4, and then I'm just going to checkmate you by playing c5. You can notice this is why knight g1 was a good defense for white. Knight g1 does not allow black to do this slow recapture on c6, because if the knight were on g1, then now this rook would get munched and white would win the game. The problem is, now white doesn't have any good defense. This is actually a forced mate in 6. The only way that white can keep playing this game is to play bishop to d3, giving the white king a chance to run to c3. But now black just takes this bishop, And the king has only one square to go. It's c4. There's no help, by the way, with e5. If you play e5, then after bishop takes e5, no matter what you do with your king, d5 ends up being checkmate. The pawn has vacated from e4 where it was looking over the d5 square, and so the d5 pawn push is a mate. So the king has to run. After the king runs, we play d5 check anyway. And after the pawns exchange, sure, the c6 pawn has left the building, and so now the b5 square is open and the king can run there. But now this rook, which has been napping the entire game, plays rook to b8 with check, and the king has only a single square it can run to, which is a5. Next up is knight c6 check, and at this point, Lev Polugaevsky resigned. Because the white king has only a single square to move, that is a6, and here knight to b4 or knight to c5 are both checkmate. So a pretty astounding game by an international master with the black pieces against one of the strongest players of the day. I will definitely show some more games by Nezhmetdinov, including some games of his against weaker players, whom he beats up in an absolutely delightful way. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.